We don't have to say anything that would be held against us immortally. I mean, all we have to do is start.
Yes.
It's like beginning an artwork. You have to plunge into the middle before you do anything at all, and then you worry about where you are later.
Well, I'm not going to start with radical coherency, but the back cover of Talking of Boundaries, when you talk about being professional, and you say what kind of a professional was Socrates, and I guess what we discussed this morning was the idea of how professional do you have to be an art critic, for instance, or to be a critic, or to be a writer. And at the back cover you say, I've been a poet, critic, linguist, and engineer, and though this knowledge informs the book, and I guess all your books, it's not the work of a professional, of which there are by now too many that have proved too useless. And I was wondering whether we could use that as a starting point of our conversation today.
Well, for me, the professional problem emerged the first time I was asked to do a series of performances in San Diego, which I've done very rarely. The first one, I believe, was at the music experiment festival called What's Cooking, in which there were a number of critics and theoreticians from other areas that came by. Michel de Certeau was there, and a number of his semi-efficient friends, or oppositionals. Generally, there are a whole bunch of people there talking about different things. And I was giving that one talk there, and then I was doing another talk at San Diego State, because they wanted me to come to talk there, which is a separate university in the same city. And there, I had a feeling that something was slightly preposterous about the notion of their inviting me because I was a very important professional critic. And I never thought of myself as important or influential, because to be influential requires you to be closer to the mainstream than I like being. I always regarded myself as somewhat of an eccentric, standing somewhere outside the basically banalities of the stream, which took the easiest pathways, the deepest parts to go to, where the hardest places to go, they never went. So I took on the question of why I'm not a professional, to ask the question of why professionality didn't determine what I did. Now, I wasn't hired at the University of California, San Diego, because of my professionality as a literary art historian or literary historian, which I wasn't. Although I confess to having a considerable knowledge of both fields, reluctantly. It occurred sometime before that, a person had come up to me at the end of a reading, a talk I had done, and she was the wife of the head of the English department at San Diego State, who was himself a rather charming actor, which he did as well as being a literary historian. He was also an actor. And I guess he was kind of professional in that too, as for San Diego. And so I gave my talk, and this woman came up to me, and turned out to be his wife, I didn't know that. She said, "Oh, I'm so glad. I was so worried that you wouldn't be able to remember your lines." I said, "What lines?" She said, "Well, what you were speaking." I said, I didn't have any lines to forget because I didn't have any lines to remember. I really tried to find my way, which is what happens when you're lost. You don't have a professional saved person, a person who has professionally rescued himself from being lost in the desert or lost in a forest. I mean, it's the problem when you're lost in a forest and you don't know which way to go. You should take Descartes' advice and go straight ahead, because it probably won't be any worse than any other way. This was Descartes, the conciliatory movement. So, in any case, my distaste for the professional, I was hired originally to become director of the gallery at UCSD back in '68, because I had been an educational curator for the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, which I became largely as a result of the instigation of Alan Capro. That and several articles in Art News and Art Forum got me appointed to be the educational curator, which meant I would rescue shows from disasters. No, they actually had a very interesting show about of graphic work of Erwin Chernovsky, who was a very brilliant designer, but the show itself was a set of dull-looking graphic designs, the realizations of which were already in the subway system. Because Chermayeff had already redesigned the subway system for them with all sorts of graphics, and they looked good in place, but in the gallery, it looked like you were looking at second-class Bauhaus exhibition. And our director, who was in many ways very intelligent but crazy in relation to economics, which is why she didn't survive too long as the director of the gallery, asked me if I could do anything to help the show not die of exhaustion before it started. So I rented an Ura tape recorder, and I went around tape recording the live sounds of the different parts of the Boston Metropolitan Transit System, which were very different and always recognizable to natives of Boston. Not only natives, but residents of Boston. And I made a 20-minute sound loop, and I took it and hid it on top of the mock-up model of one of the new railroad cars, one of the new transit cars, which was sitting there like a beached whale. And the sound sort of liberated the show. So my job there was to save the show. Other times I was there to save the show from being blown by the artist getting angry at Sue Thurman for what she didn't take, or what she should have taken. And so I was like what in baseball they call a utility infielder. I would fill any hole that needed to be filled at any given moment. I was their representative with the New York Avant-Garde, and I put on a film series. So in any case, what I was invited to do when Sue Thurman was going underwater and the Institute for Contemporary Art was beginning to sink and send up bubbles, I decided to accept the job in San Diego, which I had no knowledge of at all, as director of the art gallery and an assistant professor of art criticism. They had no other art critic there, but I was the one art critic. It turned out to be one of the best things I ever did was to accept the San Diego deal, because San Diego was it was described to me by several people that they had a great avant-garde music department, which they did, and they described the university as a group of scientists standing under a palm tree holding out an open checkbook. This was an exaggeration because they were paying me the enormous figure of $11,500 a year, which in those days was plenty of money, but it didn't make you too affluent. But we got by on it very well because I was used to graduate grants, which were much smaller than that. In any case, and besides, when I ran into trouble, I would simply translate something from some scientific work and make enough money to survive. But anyway, there I was in San Diego as an art critic, having to see things by going into New York most of the time or going to Los Angeles, because San Diego had artists, but it had no scene. And everything felt happily unprofessional. That is, everything I saw, like John Baldessari, who was one of my closest friends in San Diego, was a perfect example of a funky, anti-professional painter who gave up painting to become a conceptual artist before the name had become totally fashionable. And he was a wonderfully idiosyncratic guy, and I think most of the work of the Californians was idiosyncratic. Idiosyncrasy seemed to be the strong suit, and idiosyncrasy is always anti-professional. There's no strong suit of idiosyncrasy in a profession. It becomes like something of a clownishness that you can play with, or can use as an obstacle. Like I always said, that the act of criticism is not always an interpretation. Sometimes it's an attempt. You see the whole crowd running down this great corridor to get to some place, and you stick out your foot to change the direction of traffic. This was one of my ideas as to how one should go about being an artist in San Diego or an art critic. It seemed to work. Does that answer any of the questions?
Yeah, thank you. That's
stifled them or set up something in motion?
No, I think it definitely sets the ball rolling. which is up now to...
So one of the questions that appeared this morning following your answer to this question about professional criticism and non-professional criticism, or not being a professional critic, was also the question of affect, that perhaps the difference between some of the pieces that one finds here, perhaps the Warhol piece and other pieces such as, which are closer to talk poems, radical coherency, and these is perhaps the amount of affect that you put in there, and that perhaps distinguishes these pieces from I guess, I don't know what to call it, but perhaps professional criticism would be a good way to put it. So
well, I always had an attraction to the concrete as opposed to the abstract in theory. I mean, the notion of something, you have something concretely you're addressing in some way. And you address it as well as you can, but none of the formulas are previously applied. There's no point in doing something that's been well done. If there's something that's been well done, it's time to forget about it and take on something that hasn't been well done. Like I was persuaded at one point by the editor of Arts Magazine to review a show of Mondrian's architecture, of a room Mondrian had supposedly designed that they were trying to hustle as an art object. And I was asked to do this thing, and I think I suspected that I was being asked to do this to make it more profitable for the dealer to hustle it. So I wrote an article called Mondrian the Dancer, which was not exactly what they were looking for, because what I used as the central image of the thing was the notion that the story told by Sybil Mahoney-Nudge, his wife, who was a very intelligent and actually a rather brilliant non-professional critic herself, described the fact that Mondrian was a passionate ballroom dancer, but that no woman could ever follow him. And I used that as the basic approach to what his paintings were about. They were set up so that nobody could follow him. And I think the way in which he did this is that I argued that you're not looking at a perfectly balanced painting. What you're looking at is this. You're looking at a painting in which something will always distract you from what you're trying to concentrate on. Because the painting size is just such that the little red dot is at the little square, tiny square of red. It's just on the edge of the periphery irritating you. And if you turn and confront it, it goes dead, but then the cold blue goes deader on the left. So in effect, what he was doing is he was performing a kind of dance with your psychological capabilities of seeing. Your idea, in other words, interest was being diverted. One might have even said that his idea of dancing was a little bit the way some people describe bullfighting. You're dragging the cape in front of the bull, and the bull comes charging toward it, but you're not there, and the bull is there, looking a little bewildered. The only thing is, in this case, you're not stabbing Mondrian. The Mondrian is teasing you. And I thought that this was probably as interesting an article as I could have written on the Mondrian. It was about the general organization of all Mondrian. That his notion of equilibrium was not true. There's an equilibristic tension that he creates. And the editor of Arts and I quarreled over it. I withdrew the piece, and I said I wouldn't write for them again. I was sufficiently high-handed and was delighted not to be doing the damn piece. But again, I wouldn't have taken on the Mondrian, except somehow I saw this way of looking at Mondrian that was different from the usual, either his spiritual rap, for which I didn't give 2 cents, and his notion of balance, which was not a notion of balance, it was a notion of equalized tension, which in some sense makes him sound a little bit closer to Hans Hofmann, with the notion of push-pull. But that always seemed to me had a lack of subtlety compared to the Mondrian, which the Mondrian is a genius of distraction. And I thought that to take on Mondrian that way is really quite different. It's provocational. So it's seeing the artist as a kind of agent provocateur, which appealed to me very much. And we tend to forget how early modernists were as much provocateurs as anybody working in the 60s. because they were kids as well. They were also all very young, and all very lively, and all very much against the standards of the system. And it's hard to figure. Sometimes it's hard for people to remember. These were a bunch of kids, lively kids. Just whatever else. And it's hard to figure. Sometimes it's hard for people to remember. These were a bunch of kids, lively kids. Just whatever else they were. Yeah.
Your description of the Mondrian, what you saw in the Mondrian, was making me think of the structure of many of the essays. And the idea of using eccentricity as a kind of engine, and the idea of just not distraction, but the adding this new element, this contingency, that then, and I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about the structure and how you see it, how it comes about. Is it an intuitive thing? How much gets redone when you go from a talk piece into a written piece, etc.?
Well, what happens is everybody has, I think, her own or his own idiosyncrasy as for how you start something. I always tend to brood about it for a while until something comes to me as problematic, and I look for some fissure through which I can try to enter, and sometimes it takes a little extra hammering away at it to make the fissure large enough to enter. And I'm always even skeptical of my first entry, usually, into it. So what I do is I start to try to make sense of something, sense that is active sense. Like artworks, for me, if they're interesting, have energy. Well, actually, it occurred to me that I have something here that might help explain it. It happened to be on my BlackBerry. It was an email from Martin Esquel, a novelist and poet. I guess you know Martin, don't you?
I know, yes.
Martin asked me a question to which I responded, which kind of gives an idea of like what I think I'm trying to do when I'm answering or trying to respond to something where a question is proposed from someone else or from me. So let me just find you the exchange with Martin. Martin wrote to me asking me about the Wittgenstein essay in the book. And of course I took up Wittgenstein. I was supposedly writing a review of Marjorie Perlow's book, Wittgenstein's Ladder, and I started to do that when I realized that Marjorie had done a very good job of that, but had left out everything about what would constitute Wittgenstein as a poet. What exactly the hell was he doing? Because he certainly wasn't doing philosophy in a straightforward way, even in the back of the Tractatus, or even especially with the Tractatus. So I decided I would take on the whole notion of why I thought of Wittgenstein as a poet, beginning with the seemingly unapproachable Tractatus. And let me just get this. Here it is. Let me get it. It's just a couple of weeks ago that he wrote it to me. David, reading through your piece on Marjorie's book on Wittgenstein, when Wittgenstein says that we can only think logically, I think he means that logic is linguistic. For example, she pulled the rabbit from the cloud would be a logical statement. Is that your understanding of Wittgenstein's sense of logic and imagination? That was Martin's question. Whoops. Let me go down and a little bit. Okay, that was Martin's question, and then came my response. This was no. This line is from the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein was proposing a logical grammar in contradistinction to a conventional grammar for a language whose sentences are all propositions. That is, they're either true or false. It's not our language. In this language, you may say, clouds signify your greener rest, but you can't think it. It is ungrammatical. Now, it seemed to me that Martin had an interesting idea, but it was a little simple for the Wittgenstein. He didn't take the trouble to get a little bit closer to the Wittgenstein to find out enough about it. and I thought I would help clarify it. Martin was generous in his response to my response. He didn't get offended by it. He said, "Oh yes, thanks. It's been a while. Of course that we celebrate is about what we celebrate is how this line, the green arrest, for example, makes one want to absorb, understand, interpret it, while at the same time being unable to think it, which is lovely for its being on the edge of understanding, hovering there, and at the same time putting into a relief understanding and comprehension, at the same time as in the moment of trying to think, understanding and comprehend it, to understand and comprehend it, during which the mind comes to silence." Now Martin's response to me was so much better than his initial question, and sufficiently subtle that I felt very gratified that I had really taken the trouble to respond to him, even though I was afraid he would be offended by my abrupt no, because he suddenly took the point of, like, at the end of the critical discourse that we raised about Wittgenstein, what you really become aware of is the nature of his thinking, and the nature of the limits of his thinking, and the nature of what it leaves you with when you can't think of something, when you can't think something, or the notion that you can't think that green arrest. In the end, it's because the notion of what you mean thinking is limited in certain ways. And Wittgenstein is ready to concede that at all points, but people forget that he's willing to concede that understanding itself is a limited activity. I, for example, have spent a great deal of energy attacking the theory of understanding. What I've said is that people don't in tuning, which is my term for replacement for understanding, I said that we don't understand each other. We tune to each other. And tuning is not the same as understanding. Understanding is an image that is essentially drawn from the notion of elementary plane geometry, the idea of congruence. So we have that our idea is we come to a situation where our mind has a triangle of a certain shape and configuration and size, which is exactly equivalent to somebody else's luminous triangle of knowledge. And there's no discrepancy between the two. That constitutes total congruence, and that's what the word understanding tends to suggest because of the way it's built. In French, the idiomatic is still there, although it's not quite like that. It's comprendre, which is essentially to enclose. And you suppose that it sort of sits on the boundaries of the closure regarding the arena that is enclosed as what is identical. Now, I believe that this is a mistake, and my whole book, Tuning, was dedicated to arguing that what we do is by going together, we make processes of action that are common actions or actions conducted in common can lead to types of agreement, new types of agreement. And I use two people walking together, a tall man and a small woman, which happens to some degree when I work with Ellie. Well, again, you take these things from wherever they come in your experience, which is another thing I'll be talking about Friday. You're trying to walk with Ellie. Ellie has very short legs compared to mine, which are not so long compared to other people's, and for me to adjust walking at the same speed as she is without going past her, or slowing down and letting her go past me artificially, it's an act of complicated negotiation where she hustles a little bit more and I drag a little bit more, or I try to take shorter steps, and we succeed intermittently. I also suggested that this is probably even more a relationship if you want to describe making love. That in making love you probably have a more amusing version of it, but the point is that the neutral version suits me quite well. But then I ask, is this the same thing as singing together? An improvisational group that sings chorally together would try to seek forms of agreement, chordal agreements that were of some sort acceptable. Now, chordal agreements don't have to be identical. In other words, you can sing a line a fifth above or below, or a third, a fifth or below, or some dissonant amount, like a minor third. A minor third might be acceptable form of agreement, or it might not, depending on the people you're dealing with. So, in other words, an improvisational choral singing thing would be an act of negotiating what constitutes agreement, which I call tuning. And in this sense, I feel that if I set something in motion, I don't expect people to listen to what I say and agree with me. they can try to go with me a certain degree by walking together with me in my pieces to some degree, and get the benefit of like what's there, as Martin suggests. Not because we're in total agreement, but because the degree of agreement allows certain images to come out of what you're dealing with. So I think my Mondrian argument, like all other arguments, has problems. All arguments about what an artist is about tend to be incomplete. They have shaggy aspects hanging over the edge and holes in them, but it's a good working attempt to say Mondrian is not a static artist. He's not a high formalist. He's a provocateur. And it opens you to looking at Mondrian again. Now, it's interesting that I look at Mondrian now almost all the time, and I was shocked once by a collector. I went to a show of Alan D'Arcangelo. Alan was an old friend of ours. He had a show, and there was a party thrown for him by one of his collectors. And it was in one of these fancy apartments on the west side of Central Park. Big apartment with all sorts of work in it, and every single work was mediocre. It was surprising. I was like astonishing to see the reliability of this guy's choice of artworks was which ones were totally inert. And then I went into the bathroom and I saw the first Mondrian I ever saw that didn't work. And I said, my God, this guy is an absolute genius to be able to find these works that were like that. And there was one work that shook me. It was a great exception. It was a 2-inch square piece of card with a mad drawing on it by Max Ernst. And I realized the reason he got it was it came as a New Year's card or a Christmas card, I don't know which. And he didn't choose it, it chose him. So you see what I think Martin's right, that what happens is I rewrote his line because I didn't feel it was sufficiently ungrammatical. So I introduced the green arrest to get away from the naturalistic. The rabbit taking something out of a cloud is too naturalistic to count as ungrammatical. It's too easy to think it because we have so many dopey cartoons with jackrabbits performing all sorts of things, including brain surgery. We can imagine animals doing anything that human beings can do, often in stupefying ways. But nobody knows what it means to be a green arrest. And no matter what you say about it, it's not going to become logical. So you can't visualize it in the same way. You can't imagine it the way you can imagine a rabbit taking something out of a cloud, which is really easy to imagine. And Wittgenstein's not so much trying to tell you how to imagine things, he's trying to find a way to understand something, to use the term understanding. But what he does is he narrativizes what he's doing. In other words, if Wittgenstein wants to find out what expectation is, he starts telling you a story about waiting for a first date. This guy is coming and he doesn't know whether he smokes or not, so should he lay out cigarettes for him, whatever. And everything is about the slight anxiety of having a first date, which if you don't read it that way, you're losing Wittgenstein. And as I said in the piece, this is an example of a just vernacular, low melodrama version of Schoenberg's Erwartung, which also means expectation. But there it's a disaster on a high expressionist level, and in Wittgenstein it's the embarrassment of a first date. But by enacting the first date anxiety, he kind of gives you a better idea of the meaning of the word in that context, what anticipation, expectation might be. Like when I talk about understanding, I try to get at it. Like I tried to get at understanding because I kept feeling everybody understands too goddamn much. I mean, I've always find that when I come to an artwork that's interesting, everybody understands things I don't understand. They're all smarter than I am. They know immediately the answer to questions that I haven't even proposed yet. And then I start proposing the questions, and they're very different from the questions they propose, and the answers are very different. And it all starts from my deliberately concentrating on what I don't understand. If I don't understand something, I know I'm on the right track. I constantly hope to to be frustrated by trying to understand something, which I don't try to do, or trying to find agreement with something, I generally give an artwork a decent grade. That is, I assumed that the people there were smart enough to do something that was worth doing. Like Rothko, who I had never been a great admirer of. When I started being an art critic, I preferred the much blunter versions of painting, like Frank Stella, whose paintings I thought were very strong at the time, back in the early 60s. But I tried to say, well, what was there in the Rothko that I wasn't getting? All these intelligent people I knew got something out of the Rothko that I wasn't getting, because I didn't see any spirituality in it. I saw corrupt rhetoric describing the Rothko, which looked interesting, but it certainly didn't seem to me it had anything to do with the spirit. And I started trying to address it, because what happened was I was at a conference, and one of those desperately college art association conferences where you're there to hire somebody for you. I decided, Sheldon, no, I went actually with a friend of ours who was living in, I wasn't where I was there with Sheldon, I was there with Ellen Zweig, an artist friend who happened to be living for that time in Houston. And she and I went to the Rothko Chapel together to look at it. And I was amazed by two things. One, it had been described by so many people as black, that these were black paintings. And I thought this was a blood libel. They not only were apparently not black, they had deep, dark, plum-colored tones and reddish tonalities that would be sort of filtering through the thing, except for the one piece that starts in back of you, where there's a kind of obvious color intervention into the field of black, which I called a kind of blunt intervention, unlike any of his pictures. And I asked, why did he do this? Rothko, who may have been the most sophisticated, subtle artist that we've ever known as a painter, why did he make this blunt intervention into his black field? Or looked like apparently to a black field. On a cloudy day, the Rothkos there look black. On a sunny day, they're not black at all. If the lighting system, even if the lighting system is turned on a cloudy day, they're not going to, the color won't show very well. But so I asked, why the hell would he make such an obvious one? It occurred to me that it was intended to be a quote. That it was a quote from his earlier work, which he was rejecting as being insufficiently adequate to the issue of perception. That it was about perception, about the relationships between which colors come forward, where is the light coming from, and the meaning of the sources of light and darkness, or what he was doing ever since the Harvard murals. And he had been doing them earlier in the individual paintings themselves, but in a rather limited way. So I was just, what was it? And I decided to consider that painting in back of you to be a kind of quotation of his earlier work, quotation and rejection of his earlier work, saying, it's not like that. It's like the octagon we are in now, it's different. And you can't, and the octagonal shape becomes the whole drama because you can't take in the whole octagon in a single glance. And not only can't you take it in a single glance, when you see one part of it, you can't be sure you're remembering exactly what the other part of it looked like. Because the subtlety was so great that you had to. First question I asked myself, are these things the same or are they different? The two sidemost panels, are they exactly equivalent or are there subtle differences? You can't look at them together, so how do you decide that? Well, you look at one, try to remember, and look at the other one. But after you've been looking at Rothko's in the chapel for some time, your eyes become fatigued, and your ability to see them begins to change. So you either see more because you see it more intelligently, or you see it less because your eyes are more exhausted. And then something else can happen, like a cloud can pass over the light of the skylit room, and it changes the lighting and throws into shade something that wasn't in shade before. So you begin to feel doubt about your own capability for making judgments. And then I realized this whole thing was an existential argument about your fading capacity, your inability to know whether your capacities are fading or not. It's not that we inevitably fade and disintegrate and we're a transient steady state system, but we aren't even sure about the degree of decline. We're not sure whether it's a temporary decline produced by contingent circumstances or whether it's a real decline in one's life pattern. So the Roscoe became suddenly opened up for me as a total different thing. And then I saw, now I know why he did those Pompeian reds, those entries into an underworld. I mean, he was like dealing with his own, grasping his sense of his own increasing fallibility of some sort or another that he was recognizing. His inability to make clear what he had in mind. Of course, an artist can't make clear what he has in mind. He only thinks he can, or she only thinks she can. We have opinions. I have opinions about my work. I'm perfectly willing to surrender the opinions, because the opinions are not worth as much as the work. So, in any sense, but that describes somewhat of the way I work. I come on something I don't understand, and I feel very grateful to not having that as an onset, trying to come to terms with it, which will not be an understanding, but will be a kind of generative operation in which I proceed to try to form some kind of agreement with it. And the more I do it with the work, the more generous I feel I'm becoming, because I begin to accept things I would not normally accept, till I remind myself that it's going too far to agree with something. You know, really still remain a secularist. You're damned if you're going to deal with the spiritual, except in the French sense of the spirit.
I'm just curious about, you brought up secularism, and one of the things we were talking about, and this might strike you as a really corny question,
That's great.
Oh, good. But one of the things we were talking about was your work with Jerome Rothenberg and your interest in quote-unquote pre-literary or shamanistic cultures, trying to link up your work, your talk pieces, to the idea of the shaman, to the idea of the oracular speaking subject, and to the idea of inspiration, and even to the idea of the muse. I'm wondering how you see your relationship to that kind of...
Well, Jerry and I have been what I call an antipodean twin, so to speak.
Right.
That is, in some sense, we approach the same area from different sides. Jerome doesn't mind entering into the shamanistic role as a form of theater. That is, like trying it on in spite of its manifest absurdities. To me, it's an absurd intention, and it's admirable because of the courage of the absurd in it. I, on the other hand, have no truck with shamanism. What I find about oral societies that I like is I'd like to hear their dirty jokes. I'd like to hear them arguing about whether to get a divorce or not. I'd like to know why, how bad the crops were, and what are they doing about it. I want to hear the vernacular conversation, and I admire that more than shamanism. In fact, I have a very low opinion of shamanism as such. I'm totally uninterested in it. But we both share an interest in the way, the structure, like the key work in understanding, in getting a grip on what I'm doing, is in a piece called The Sociology of Art that I published in Al Sharinga, but also in Talking at the Boundaries. It's in the first book. And it's a book where I undertook to explain what I had in mind, what it was I admired about oral societies, which was their great subtlety and their ability literally to be more flexible and be more radical changing than modern hierarchical bureaucratic societies have more difficulty changing things than people who work along the ground, so to speak. And like if you wanted to take up something like canoe making, the oral culture has two people has it taught in a particular way. It's not taught to teach you how to make a copy of what the object is. It's taught to do it. You're taught to do it in the right way. It's like a learning process on how to do it. First, you go away and you think for a while. You get a piece of wood that you might want to use, and you think about whether it's the right piece of wood, and you sleep next to it for a week or two. And you leave it out in the rain and see how it feels in the rain, and you bring it back in and you dry it up and you put it out in the sun, and you think about it from several points of view. You look at the grain where it would crack if you split it with an adze. Then you make your first move. And it splits narrowly according to exactly what you intended it to do, because wood doesn't have your opinion about what it's like. the wood has a disagreement with you, and it does what it wants to do. So you have to learn to adapt to the wood. And over the course of a certain couple of weeks, you've learned to adapt to the wood to such an extent that you're able to make a boat out of it. And then you have to make sure that the boat is designed perfectly so it doesn't keel over to one side or the other. And you make the delicate shavings that even out the weight system. Now that's a way of working that is more certain to produce satisfaction at the end of it than if you bought a boat in Sears Roebuck. Well, yeah, if you bought a boat from a corporate entity, the corporate entity is living in a producer society, not a consumer society, and it makes things that have been designated appropriate and convenient for the producer. So he makes the kind of crummy boat that he makes because he's trying to make the maximum profit out of it, not to make the perfect boat. The perfect boat would drive him crazy. It was too many human hours of work. So they don't do that. What they do is they sell you the thing that takes the least possible time and the least possible effort to create, that you will still consider satisfactory in spite of its inherent crumminess. You have specialists in the field in crumminess, but you also have counter-adventures. Certain car designers are so passionate about their work, and they redesign their car, like some of these Mexican kids redesigning their car to be beautiful in their manner of speaking, and their ability to make it spring up and down is like a handiwork that is like not capable of being achieved by General Motors or in other words, the notion, the creation of artifacts of great satisfaction, which I would call artworks, is not easily generated by corporate style. And what we've done in the Industrial Revolution is we have learned how to demean our production in such a manner as to make it adequately profitable, and make it adequately profitable when it bears the burden of payoffs to a large group of otherwise indolent figures who don't play any part in its production. So the CEOs are doing terrific, and the boat isn't doing so well, it sank. I mean, I've had used cars long enough to know this. I had a Sunbeam Talbot once. Back in the 1960s, I had an old Sunbeam Talbot, which was a wonderful four-seater convertible made in England, which, as everybody knows, is you're looking for trouble with an English car. And this one is not only trouble; it had its gear shift in backwards, so what looked like first gear was reverse. And I realized it had the great advantage it could never be stolen in the street. Because you broke into the car and started it up and put it into first and slammed into the car behind you. And panicked you to all hell. And so this was a kind of unstealable car. Now, I don't know why they did this thing, but I never wanted to change it because I was so happy with the car that started with a gear shift in a different place that I got used to the car. Which I think is often what you have to do is you have to adapt to something rather than adapt it to you. But it depends on it. I don't mind adapting to certain things. So, in any case, I think I addressed it in this case that I respect Jerry's interest in the transcendental shaman, but to me it's goofy. And Jerry is very much like me in other ways. For example, I did the first talk piece I did in a poetry contest was a piece called "What Am I Doing Here?" Because I came there with no books in my hand, and I was the San Francisco Poetry Center. I came there without a book in my hand. Jerry and I were reading at the same reading. He was reading first, and I was reading second. And Kathy Fraser introduced us in this rather comical way in which Jerry was being described as the poet of the great past and the great tradition of the past tradition had been undiscovered. And I was the future. So the futuristic virtue, which I don't know if it really added up to anything, but the first thing happened is I posed to ask the question, what am I doing here? And it was a literal question because I didn't bring any books. How can you do a reading without books? The answer is you can talk. You can think out loud, which is a little dangerous, but the one thing I wanted to talk about that was that Jerry also has a line in Cockboy, one of his funny poems, in which he says, somebody says, "What am I doing here?" Cowboy is giving us cockboy, and he says, "What am I doing here?" And I'm saying, and my piece says, "What am I doing here?" And Jerry is mimicking some rabbinical East Side figure talking about his visions as possibly a fur trapper and adapting to the Indians of the far West. Whereas all I'm doing is saying, what am I doing here? I'm surrounded by these native poets who write in the native language of poetry, where I basically compose without the native language of poetry. I compose in the poetry of the street. And I identify with writers like Prévert and Villon and Eustache Lejeune. I have a French bias, but, well, you know, Rabelais, Montaigne are poets whose work I basically find very appealing. And the thieves argot of you know, that I like. It's the mock scholarliness of Rabelais with his sort of hysterical hyperbolic style, or Montaigne's uncertainty. I mean, Montaigne, I always said that Montaigne is literally one of the missing links in the history of the great eccentrics of postmodernism. He stands somewhere before Kierkegaard and after Socrates, and it seems to me that it goes through a variety of people, but I'm interested essentially in the secular, the vernacular, as probing into, from a secular point of view. Like the Rothko Chapel story is essentially an analysis of the existential problematics of the Rothko Chapel. It's totally conducted in what I would call the mixed high vernacular. It's the vernacular in which people think. It's not the vernacular of like a street hustler, but if I chose to do that at some point, it would be only to give a sample of it. I wouldn't regard that as mine either. I talk my own dialect, I figure I'm my own idiolect, which is probably enough like most other New Yorkers of my generation, especially the ones who have been reasonably educated. Like my accent is not normally described as a classical New York accent for reasons I'm not sure of. I think because they imagine that New York accent as being always illiterate and always incapable of intellectualism. So you used to have in the old days Jewish scholars avoiding their home dialect, but with a fake English dialect. When I first got at the University of California, San Diego, all the assistant professors spoke as if they had learned to be British. And it was very funny, because they really, you've done graduate work in linguistics, and I would sit down and do the phonological analysis of their speech, which was really kind of absurd. They would have the most insane pronunciations, a little bit, and it was a little bit like the story told me by my phonology professor, a man named Hubble, an old, clever old guy, and he said, when he was a graduate student in Columbia, they had a poet coming to read, and the person set the tape record, the wire record the proceedings. And they had this guy there, he said, he came in, and he said, and he read something like this: April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land. You know, and he said, this guy didn't know what language he was speaking. And I said, you're probably right, he didn't. I thought he was an Englishman and they didn't believe him. But the academic discourse of young historians was probably contaminated by this idea of British correctitude. Whereas we could have corrected the British by New York correctitude, and it would have been just as silly.
Was your French, when you spoke about your French bias, was that similar to Frank O'Hara's, John Ashbery's French bias?
I'm sorry.
When you spoke about your French bias, your liking for French poets, was that also a way not to like British literature? Was that a way to look for another tradition in letters?
Well, I think the point is this, that I have always liked certain English poets, like Geoffrey Chaucer. And I thought Chaucer was the master of a great vernacular. And I love D.H. Lawrence. I love Lawrence's poetry. And Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins. I also like the kind of deadly satirical style of Alexander Pope. I am someone who is not as his dog at Q. Pray tell me, sir, whose dog are you? I like, again, I have a taste for the back, and there are certainly English poets I like, but the English poets who dominated the Brit scene were in fact the most dismal academics I had ever encountered. So it wasn't, whereas whether you were reading Mallarmé or Rimbaud, you didn't have to make excuses for what they were saying, or how they said it. I mean, it was even like reading a crackpot fascist nut like Céline, the prose crackles. I mean, there's an energy there that is admirable and free of academic constraint. Now, he, of course, was probably half insane, but that gave him an edge that was more interesting than reading Philip Larkin. I mean, when somebody says Philip Larkin, I fall asleep. Tom Gunn. I mean, Seamus Heaney. These are the names of illustrious foreigners I can't bear. Besides which, who needs to translate Beowulf? Read goddamn Beowulf without translation. But you can't get close to Beowulf. It really doesn't work. I mean, it's a cultural space you can't occupy really, and you have to treat it as an exoticism and deal somehow with its brilliance of what it is in a way that they don't do. I mean, like, how can somebody like a Brit 20th century poet produce a sound that makes sense out of that Anglo-Saxon material? The answer is they can't, and they don't. They produce an absurd, banal alternate. Whereas Chaucer, if you wanted to, as it were, do Chaucer in an English colloquial, you could do it very simply, because it's a highly elegant vernacular. Homer is a complicated story, but no British poet ever sounds like Homer. Thank God. Which is a name I take in vain. No, I actually had deep affection for the German tradition also. That is, I grew up on German poetry as well. And, Kafka, I consider Kafka a poet. Kafka and Morgenstern are two of my favorite poets that are German. Rilke was, as far as the Book of Images goes, though I detest the Duino elegies as transcendental garbage. Well, I have a new essay coming out in Critical Inquiry. It's an essay, or either that, it's an essay or a talk piece, because it's both. And it's called Hiccups. And it's an attack on Levinas and Blanchot's approach to poetics, in which I point out that what they admire is always the same thing. That is, they always admire a certain kind of extreme of transcendentalism. You have Hölderlin as their example, who's a wonderful poet, but a crazed poet. And they always cite Hölderlin, Rilke, and Kafka, and sometimes some other poet, I'm not sure who. And when I did the piece, I remembered who it was. But there was a line in a New Yorker of a poem about John Ashbery, who seems to have become the magazine poet of the New Yorker. And it was kind of average Ashbery poem, which was all right, but it wasn't distinguished. But there was one line that caught me. It says, when you have hiccups, it's always different. And it occurred to me that these theorists never take up the issue of the poem that's built on that idea. And they're never capable of dealing with it. Like Lana Turner, get up. you know, but no, they want something like every single angel is terrible, or like who if I cried out would hear me among the angelic orders. The answer is no one. The answer is no one is there, Reiner. No one is there. They don't hear you. The wind is blowing the words back into your mouth. But Rilke is the master of the German subjunctive. He's probably has more rhymes ending on the subjunctive than you can believe. Like the Panther poem, which is rather a marvelous one from the Book of Images, where his glance is seen as the bars have passed over across his face so often, across his look so often, that he thinks there are 1,000 bars and there is no world. You know, you have this thing, and the German is wonderful as it ends on a subjunctive passage where it says, "Ihr müsst also es 1,000 Stäbe geben und hinter diesen Stäben keiner Welt." It seems to him as if there were 1,000 bars, and behind those bars there was no world. Now, as it were, is Rilke disclaiming his understanding of the Panther, which I think is a very honorable thing to be doing. I think he's always willing to, all but the Duino elegies, he's willing to surrender. And even there, the first line itself of the first elegy it has a subjunctive in it. It's wer wenn ich schreie, and the schreie is subjunctive. Wer wenn ich schreie, hört mich aus den Engel ordnen. And he starts in the subjunctive and he never gets past it because it doesn't exist. So in effect, my taste for European poetry is probably because I was unsatisfied with what was going on in America. And it could be German, it could be French, or Italian, or Spanish. Spanish was also a language that we found poets liberating ourselves from. Jerome was very attracted to Lorca, and for me Lorca was too many almond blossoms and orange trees, but I loved Neruda. And Jerry did a beautiful translation of I'm called Walking Around. I'm tired of walking around, which is a terrific poem. Of Lorca's the one poem that always I remember with great pleasure was the death of the bullfighter, which was actually rather brilliant about the death of his friend. So again, I would scavenge any language I could handle for a poet to put together a tradition that would be secularist and brilliant.
It reminds me of what Emmanuel Locard says of his desire to translate other poets and American poets, creating something or having something appear in the French language that was not possible before the translation, and therefore sort of gaining ground on the French language, but from another perspective, and translating the American poets, because this was language he would never have access to. He would never have had access to other than that. So it's just the issue of translation in his work.
I understand it. I always said that. I mean, I remember saying as a slight provocation of my friend Annette Michelson, who was a Francophile much greater than I am. I said she was talking about the French language and the French tradition. I said, well, it really was okay. I mean, but once they got past Villon, it lost its way to the Pléiades, one of the most boring poets in the world. And I said, like the language went the wrong way. If it went the way of Rabelais and Villon, the literary tradition would have been stronger. The French poetic tradition, it managed to produce some really great poets, but at a terrible expense. That is, the vernacular was held at bay in some sense really all the time, even in the kind of weirdness in which the past definite seems to be a mark of the problem. There's a certain real problem that French poetry had, that it couldn't really speak the vernacular honestly, because the Academy is looking over its shoulder. And it's in spite of which there were terrific, terrific poets. Like, for example, Un Coup de Day is a wonderful poem, but it's almost always misunderstood anyway. Basically, it's a poem about shipwreck and probability. And you say, how do you say probability? Well, the answer is that the title isn't what they think it is. When you say Un Coup de Day, you mean one throw of the dice will not abolish chance. It's not a throw, it's one throw. And the answer is, in probability theory, that's absolutely the case. One throw of the dice is irrelevant to probability. It's totally, and the shipwreck, the shipwreck that is basically flirted with in the poem is essentially like the shipwreck that celebrated or mourned by Hopkins in the Wreck of Deutschland. And I always thought that there was a relationship between the two poets, which I don't know if there's a scholarly backup for that, but I always thought they were dealing with the same marine disaster. And what is happening in the French poem is an attempt to deal with, how do you deal with the contingent, the profound, terrifying contingent. And that poem's power resides in the notion of you realizing everything that he talks about is contingency. In which case there is no telos and there is no systematic purpose of things. And the religious reading of the Hopkins is a Jesuit reading it in a way that tries to make sense of it in Catholic terms. And the French tries not to make sense of it, which is a superb version of how to deal with it. How do you deal with the shipwreck? It's like, it reminds me of the account given by Thoreau of going out to see the ship that was returning Margaret Fuller to the United States with her husband and her children, and the ship is capsized off the coast of Rockaway, I believe, they couldn't get help to it in time, and everybody drowned. And the accident of them being in an unavailable rescue party. I mean, Thoreau records standing there and gasping at the horror of not being able to help, which is different and more powerful than Hopkins. Hopkins is a beautiful poet, but he was hampered by Catholicism because it nailed him downward from dealing with the true horror, which has nothing to do with anything reconcilable with belief. The tragedy is the tragedy, this waste of human life based on technological inadequacy. It's like when a space capsule fails, some contractor has done what he usually does. It's like we've been told that nuclear energy is possible because if you conceal something in cans that will in fact keep it protected for 2,000 to 3,000 years, it will be fine. But what contractor will guarantee 2,000 to 3,000 years of safety? And who will be there to take his place, to replace him as the guarantor when he dies at the age of 50 or 60? And there is still 1,900 or 4,000 years to go. So, again, you can see my taste is resolutely secular. And I love the sound of Hopkins. Hopkins' ability to experience something like Margaret, Golden Grove on Leaving is a beautiful, beautiful image, and so are many of the sonnets. But he was an inventor within a kind of decayed medium. In a certain sense, the idea of writing a sonnet is absurd. And Hopkins was able to leap over that obstacle by a kind of mad metric. That is, he fought one metric with another metric, and they fought it out completely. And the Hopkins-Wilder metric wins. But at the level of what seems to be the content, Catholicism wins and Hopkins loses. 3-0. That's the Trinity.
I was wondering, can you tell us more about your interest in machines?
In machines?
Yeah. talk about.
Well, I grew up with them. They were like pets that I adopted and took in stray pets. I also had jobs where I was paid to repair machinery. You see, when I was a kid, I mean, like high school age, I had two alternative ideas to do. The one idea that was clearest to me was that I would be an inventor. I wanted to be an inventor, and that's why I had gone to a high school that was an engineering school. There were 3 special high schools that I could have chosen to go to for special high-class education. One was Brooklyn Tech, one was science was way up north in the Bronx, and Brooklyn Tech was closer, but still far enough to take a subway so I could get away from my family. It was the first choice I made to alienate myself from parts of my family and become living in the free world. For me, the free world was living away from home. Brooklyn Tech was, I loved the machine shops. And I used to pride myself on how brilliantly I could make grind tool bits, which was an achievement. And I loved working on an engine, not on the engine lathe, which was impersonal, but on little bench lathes where you turn the thing by hand, you adjust it by hand, and I loved the feel of the bench lathe. And I loved making things for casting, and we had courses in casting and courses in machining stuff. And it was one of the great pleasures. I still to this day could probably make a diagram of a Bessemer converter or an open hearth furnace, which I had drawn very lovingly in a notebook that my mother, in a fit of rage against my alienated character, destroyed the 2 nights before it was graded. And somehow or other I didn't murder her, which I regard as an example of total triumph of virtue. So yeah, I had many jobs that depended. Most kids got summer jobs that were less well paying because I was a reasonably accomplished machinist. So I could get jobs that depended upon my skill or my ability to sell myself as skillful, and then I'd be able to do what they needed to be done. But it turned out that the kind of inventor I wanted to be was not an engineer, but a writer. I discovered this while I was in college, and although I had like a friend of mine, Wilson, his name was Wilson, he was a novelist also, was an old friend of mine. We used to hang out together in Brooklyn bars on the Notre Dame and plan to do a great movie of Finnegan's Wake. Gertrude Stein was my other entry into modern experimental poetry. I discovered 3 lives in the school library. God knows how come they did it, but Tech was a very good school, so it must have been somebody in the English department who said, get Gertrude Stein, although I couldn't find any of her other books there. But if you discover Gertrude Stein at 16, the world looks much more open than if you discover Philip Larkin.
It comes again.
Well, I use him as an example because he's not the worst. Well, I mean, they would say he's among their better poets, and if they use that as an example, I would say that he has the same problems that Robert Frost has, a decayed rhetoric. Like I have in this book a severe attack upon Frost as suffering from an insufficiency of gracefulness, and the language is wooden. And the trouble is with its woodenness is not an individual defect. It was a cultural defect at the time he was writing. That the gentility of the notion of what constituted literature, there was a notion of gentility and a refinement attached to it that wouldn't let him use the natural flow of the language. And his metric often kills his line, because he says things like, something there is that does not love offense. You mean there's something that doesn't love offense? No, he means something there is that does not love offense. Why does it require that absurdity? I could say elves to him. Like hell you could. this other farmer, the adjacent farm, they're talking about the value of repairing the fence between them to keep them separated. And I say, there's something there is that does not love a fence, but he would want to know what it is. I could say elves to him, and nowhere in his lifetime could he have said to his next door neighbor, elves are the cause of the problem. Yeah, elves. Elves? Yeah, elves, yeah, they would kind of come around all the time around Christmas. Little elves with stocking caps. It's an absurdity. On the other hand, he's a poet of images that are strong, and so you have images that are strong in language that's very pathetic. He lived at the wrong time. 40 years later, I guess it might have been possible for him to break free because the genteel tradition was breaking up. The poem was probably written around 1906 or something like that. And by the end of the Second World War, the colloquial was beginning to make its appearance in literary works. And certainly by the time of the 50s, you had the great Renaissance read by Black Mountain and the Beats, and a whole bunch of poets that really made it open up, forced it open. People like Olson, and Duncan, and Creeley. Creeley was a superb opener of the field as well. And Duncan is, of course, the question is, how can you like Duncan? What I like about Duncan is he's absurd. His absurdity is what I like.
He liked elves, though, too.
What?
He liked elves also.
Yeah, but he treats himself to the full range of absurdity. I mean, he dances the absurdity out, and the language is hilarious.
Right. And it's looser, too,
Yeah,
in a sense.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, the trouble with Sir Frost is he's always restraining himself, trying to remain decorous, and there's no point to it. Anyway.
I'm just interested in this idea that Frost is bad because he's not sensible in a sense, and just trying to reconcile that with your love of Stein, which I share. But I'm thinking of Stein saying something like, "A little monkey goes like a donkey," you know.
Yeah, but that's manifestly absurd in a playful way, as Duncan is also. You can never take anything Duncan says as being a truthful statement.
And also, Duncan has a little touch of humor there, too.
Always.
Yeah, which Frost lacks.
Well, Frost really does lack it. I mean, he took himself very seriously, and he took his mythology very seriously. And it's a bad weakness. I'm not looking for poets to be sensible. I'm looking for them, as it were, to be comfortable in the public, in a common space shared by all of us. And they can have private spaces that are specialized for reasons that they need to, but that's not the same thing as glorifying those spaces. I mean, if Hopkins' fiery rhetoric would work for him to a degree. It's like he called up the fire and then put it out before it dealt with it. He could do anything. He didn't have the sense of the adequate. He didn't have an adequate arsonist sensibility.
This common space shared by all of us, what you just said, and the fact that you said earlier on, I don't expect people to listen to me and agree with me, and so makes me think of what you say in Fine Furs about your Sky poems, where you say they were first perhaps more democratic than any other kind of poetry, and then you add, well, perhaps they're actually more aristocratic than anything else, because I'm not thinking of the people there. They just exist, and people have to deal with them the way they can. Which led me into thinking about your talk pieces. How do they sit regarding this notion of democracy, and how do you regard your audience? Because this was one of the questions that emerged this morning, the question of your audience and your relation to your audience, whom you address sometimes directly?
Well, actually, when I was thinking of a kind of democratic aristocracy, in which anybody who wanted to could enter that democracy, if they wanted it enough. All they had to do was learn how to do it. You could learn how. You might have to learn how to read Marne, or you might have to learn to do other things like learn enough for beyond Go, or it depends what you have to do. I assume my audience is not specialized generally, not in all the things that interest me, and I'm not either. So I'm talking in what I regard as essentially a common linguistic space. And I assume that the audience will be interested in it because, I'm basically a human being and they're human beings, and we live in the same culture, more or less. And I assume that they'll be as interested as reasonable. And if it's a subject that doesn't get to them, like the machine issue, if they're not interested at all in machines, they may find some of the things I do. For example, I have a talk piece, the beginning of which consists of an enormously long account of how a mousetrap is constructed. And it amuses me that this technical device of such great elegance is devoted essentially to killing mice. And I think in a way, people will be surprised when they think about the concentrated intelligence with which the trap is constructed. There's a certain elegance to it, that, like a set of logical propositions. If this happens, this happens. If this happens, this will happen. If this happens, this will happen. Bang. It's a chain of implications. So my relationship to machines is like my relationship to certain kinds of chains of ideas.
But also, since you're mentioning that the trap thing, in that same when you mention the machine, you end up, if I remember correctly, on the fact that you actually are on a geological fault. And so that this machine can work well, but in the end, there might be a slight problem with it, which doesn't depend on the machine, but on the conditions of the machine. And so therefore, I think you're saying in the talk that the metaphor or the comparison actually doesn't work properly because there's this fault there lying there.
Ready to cause. I'm saying the contingent. Like the earth tremor that will, spring the trap of the thing is a little different from Hopkins' Ricket of Deutschland or from Marne, but ultimately it's the same notion of the contingent, the contingent interruption of your intentionality. Your ability to deal with the contingent is really the important thing, as I'm concerned. And we all deal with it as well as we can, but the contingent is never easily absorbed, except by systems that tend to break down. So, living on a fault, which we do, and all of California lives on faults, some bigger, some, and you don't know what they're going to do, and if they do it, you have to deal with it with them. There's not much you can do otherwise. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on what you said about, written about thinking by way of example? One thing that I find really incredibly original in your work is how you use narrative in approach of thinking, and so this idea of thinking by way of example, it's also, as opposed to either enchaînement de pensées claires et distinctes, or alternatives of thinking, rather than either doing theory or philosophy in a more. And I think it's linked to what you were saying about the vernacular, or what you've written about against jargon. But can you?
Well, it seems to me that it has seemed to me for a long time that a variety of philosophers have in fact done very well using the vernacular to explain the subtlest problems, approach the subtlest problems that we've ever had to deal with. Thinking by example is, for example, if you use an example of that, one of the clearest cases that comes to mind immediately is Kierkegaard's repetition. Well, it's just, or either or. I mean, two model examples of the notion of an aesthetic life or of an aesthetically justified life or an ethically justified life, however preposterous, basically is generated by two literary biographies, so to speak. One for the libertine and one for the ethical Puritan. And what he does, he writes a novella to approach the problematic. And then you have to examine the novella as the nature of the answer. Now, it is true that there's a certain representational comedy when you read Kant's critique of judgment. There's a certain comedy because Kant was just trying to figure out what the response to an artwork can be, and there's no reference to any concrete artwork at all in Kant's work. And he's wondering what artwork had he ever seen. But he's terribly intelligent, and he's able to talk about a great number of things that show up in the reputation of artworks. That is to say, what other critics have said about artworks. But you don't get as far as, you only get so far with that. I mean, I think, for example, I think that when you address an artwork, the first thing is it's addressable. You take it as an action of a human being making a kind of proposal. It seems to me that all artworks are making a proposal. And you have to decide what proposal you're hearing. What proposal is this? And how do I find out what the proposal is? And how do I get to determine the nature of the proposal, its scope? And it seems to me that's my opening. It's making a proposal, and I feel the proposal is problematic. And those are the works I took up. As an art critic, I took up the things that seemed problematic because they opened the world up to thinking. If it was a perfectly designed thing, what would you have to do? Why would you have to criticize it, deal critically with it at all? Except as an example of perfection, and then you would probably have to draw a picture of perfection that would be imperfect. And that would be helpful. The notion of the crystal in artwork is a little bit like a sugar cube. Or either it's a sugar cube or it's a little bit like a transistor. And the effective crystal structures in which there are what are called electron holes. But in any case, it seems to me that you start trying to find out what the artwork is doing addressing you. And if it refuses to address you, as some artworks do, then it's interesting to figure out why is this artwork refusing to address me? It's taking up public space. What's it doing here? If you think of Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, nobody wanted that arc there who worked there. Nobody wanted it there, and Richard Serra was an intrusion. It was a meaningful intrusion into the space. It was badly designed from a social point of view, but its provocational aspects were interesting, although they were typical of Richard. Richard would always do something that was provocational, at least until his more classical labyrinths or scroll-like things, which are intended to be monumental and sublime. And they are monumental, and I'm not strong on the sublime, so I'm not sure whether I think of them or not. They're certainly impressive. But always he was a provocateur, and the work itself would impress you with its image of the dangerous and the precarious, like those prop pieces, which they were first shown in the Pasadena Museum when it was a very strange moment, and there were string pieces telling you to stay away from them because two pieces of lead, well balanced, could be unbalanced by an earth tremor, like the mousetrap. And I saw a little 2-year-old start walking toward them. With the suddenness of a football player, the director of the museum tackled the little girl just before she got close enough and carried her out of the way. So you could tell that the work addressed you in its dangerousness. But I think you look for a notion of address. And almost all artworks propose something. I think that what caused the discomfort in minimalism was that a lot of people had trouble seeing the nature of the address. And whereas the nature of the address was, can I still make something meaningful that is not symmetrical, that is not asymmetrically elegant? Can I make something blunt and relational to you rather than presenting you an exhibition of itself? And the bluntness of the work, which I took up in an early piece on Bob Morris, is unfortunately not in the book. I could only put in one Bob Morris piece. I put in the later one. And those sort of primary structures, those sort of lozenges, those sort of wedge-shaped pieces, cylindrical pieces, they were sort of deadpans. They were deadpan and seemed not to present any argument at all, but actually there was an argument about the deadpan. And if people didn't see it, they didn't understand it, and they complained that the work itself was meaningless. It wasn't meaningless, it's just that they didn't like the meaning it projected, which was probably reasonable not to like it. But if you didn't like it, you still could understand, you could still kind of go along with it and see what it was proposing. Don Judd and Silverwood, and they were proposing in order to take out of unpromising circumstances to make the transformations of meaningful art out of what look like unpromising places, like industrial design, which I regard as totally unpromising. It's a place of broken promises.
But there is something in your work which is very clear through this last book, is the way you deal with art versus poetry, but taking a lot of issue. You're using like in contradiction with their historic situation. Like for instance, art as machine, art as experience, art as address. We could refer to all those things like constructivism, productivism, art as machine, Clara Boukine and stuff. We could, like, art as experience could be phenomenology, and we could say that also about structure. But you escape all of that, which is very exciting for us, because a lot of those issues, for instance, have been European. And you escape all of that, and you make your own film in the end, which is quite strong and impressive in the end, because but it's also to say that in a lot of ways, you're not a real postmodernist, because you are a full modernist too, because you deal with all those issues, but not the way, because you are into this anti-specialist situation, which for me is the real art criticism in the tradition of Diderot or Baudelaire, which is to deal outside of the art historian and stuff. But in the same time, you are right in between, because we talk about a little about that, but in a lot of ways, your work could be seen as the real conceptual art, which never happened. Not with Kossuth, related to Wittgenstein, or Jan Wilson related to conversation or whatever, and so it makes like this interesting situation, and it's also with radical coherency who arrives as a sort of late book, I could say, related to the talks book, and related to all your activity of criticism was a long time, and in the end, it just happened like as a sort of book, like now, like probably a very incomplete book. I mean, a very organic book, but a very incomplete related to your criticism. But so it's.
It was going to be longer, perhaps a little more complete, but it still would have been incomplete.
So maybe we would do a French version with an English text.
No, it's funny.
But how do you relate to this?
As you describe it, I realized I should have cited as one of my major influences was Harry Houdini, the escape artist.
But how do you relate to the modernist situation like that? I mean, it's like, we could make a difference between modern and modernist. And
Sure.
Yeah, that's probably something.
Well, it seems to me that basically I have tended to doubt the clarity, the way in which the most popular of the art critics define postmodernism, often by things that are really were more common before them than they knew. Often their ignorance is what allowed them to imagine certain things. For example, Jameson, who was among the most ignorant of all of them, Jameson had no experience of the range of collage that existed from the early 20th century, like from 1912, from the Picasso Braque works to the present, because basically the notion of what he calls pastiche is only a derogatory term for collage. And my argument for collage was that in radical coherence, my argument about collage is I was attempting to show what it was like. And I used my mother as the example of a typical audience member confronted by a system that was essentially to be understood, but couldn't be understood because it was dissolving, right? Things being sold off the shelves and no longer being where they would normally have been. So I'm dealing with that, and then I'm trying to say there are alternate systems for understanding, or agreement, or tuning, that collage can't give you. And collage can't give you what I call narrative. Of course, what I call narrative is not what everybody else calls narrative. So again, I seem to be in an escape mode. I mean, I define narrative very differently, and I regard my definition of narrative as important to my work as my definition of tuning. The notion of narrative I have is that I split narrative and story into two different cognitive modalities. Story I define as a sequence of events or parts of events that determine a significant transformation. Now, it's the representation of that I'm talking about. In other words, that the narrative is not like a story. A story is the sequence of events and parts of events that generate a significant transformation. But narrative is the confrontation of a desiring subject with the threat or promise or threat and promise of transformation, and the effort to either bring it about or hold it as stays or fight it off. And I've used various examples to show how this is inevitably the case, that those two things are obviously not generated the same way. One is an internal structure of the relation of subjectivity to the panic that possible change could bring. The change that you most desire can wipe you out. That is to say, you could desire to become a king of a country that, by the time you become king, suddenly revolts and executes you as a tyrant. I mean, you may be aware that there's always a problem. That if you take this road, so to speak, to use cross line, if you take this road, you're likely to get certain satisfactions out of it, but you're also likely to have your own being threatened by it. And the notion of story doesn't come with that package. It's not about the point of view. It's not about the internal representation of the difficulty of change. And change is an ontological problem. That is that you are something, or you're sort of are something. You're not something. There's something in the middle of change. I mean, we're transient steady state objects, and our transient steady state is what threatens us, because because the one desire that everybody is afraid of, the one desire is that consciousness wishes to remain conscious, and that will not happen in the end. In the end, it will be gone. So, in effect, the greatest change is almost always death or annihilation, the annihilation of the subject. And the subject is always threatened by any transformation, even a small one. I decide to move to San Diego with Ellie and I decide to go there. Ellie loses immediate contact with the New York art scene as she goes. She loses some connection to it, although she was still a young artist. and go fashion, and had to learn, but she had to learn to fashion her art career from San Diego, which finally led to her doing sending the work by postcards. She did a work of 51 postcards over a 2-year period that she mailed out. That was a kind of adventure story of a hero called 100 Boots. And you saw 100 Boots going through different phases of his life, or his life because they were male boots. And there was a kind of, I guess it was a kind of picaresque story like On the Road that could be read from the pictures. She had to construct a career that began from that space because she would move to San Diego, and she didn't know that at the time. I didn't know that I would be an art writer who was not really a reviewer. That is, I could be flown in to review, shows that they were paying me to review. The art news would often hire me to do major museum shows because that I could do from a distance, but I couldn't do week in and week out reviewing, which I didn't want to do anyway. I never wrote straight reviews of anything. The review that Dominique was talking about, the review essay on Michael Fried's Absorption and Theatricality, was easy to do because it came in the form of a book, so I didn't have to leave San Diego to do it. Well, it was a great convenience to have a book. A book is mobile. I mean, it itself may not be mobile, but you can carry it. And a lot of stuff you can transmit by means of new media communications. So my form of art criticism had to undergo a change from being on the scene to being apprehending the scene without being there, which was an interesting situation. I didn't find it hard. I also brought people in. So, like, I think I showed Keith Sonier, Richard Serra, and all sorts of other people back in '69 when they were just names that nobody knew. And I showed post-pop representational people. So I put on shows and I, brought the artists to San Diego. So I found a way to solve a problem that I didn't think about when I first undertook the problem. I've been offered other alternatives, but I didn't want. I thought it was time to leave New York, which is, I think, Spalding Gray called New York an offshore island, and I think he was quite right about it. That whatever it was like pretty offshore. Whereas California was leading the country either over the cliff or back, and it wasn't entirely clear what it was doing. But it was a dominant influence that was beginning to really be felt. The Southern California sensibility was beginning to be really felt very powerfully by the '60s. And so it was interesting being there. Whereas earlier it was interesting being in New York. The New York, I was on the New York scene from about 57 through 68. And at 68 I had decided the conceptual art, the way they were defining it, had come to the end. It hadn't really. It got broader and more interesting in the 70s. So it wasn't exhausted, it was just a particular type of conceptualism that the 60s brought in. Looked too narrow and too banal. The so-called Kossuth Mel Bachner world, which I thought was not interesting at all. It was intelligent, but it wasn't interesting.
Should we take a break? I mean, we can continue talking over coffee, tea and biscuits and chouquette. But if we want to come back afterwards and have a bit of time, we have until 5:15. So if we take a break now, and then we can start again at 4:15, we'll have an hour afterwards, continue the conversation. I mean, it's up to you, but you've been... Okay.
Like you guys went a lot of effort to get me out here.
Oh, it was a pleasure, and it's just...
I believe as a craftsman, I believe in doing the complete work. I do as well, and as an artist, I do as well as I can.
You're doing great. Thank you. I'm just going to make coffee. Good.
And we were saying that this was going to be an inconclusive conclusion for an hour to this talk, and that this seminar was like the end of your talks, where this morning we discussed the end of your talks, where you actually end, but you don't exactly conclude, and that there's the sense of an ending, but not the sense of a conclusion, that something is forever closed upon itself, but it sort of opens onto something else. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask related, I suppose, to the sense of conclusion was, is the ending of your talks determined by the materiality of the talk itself, i.e. the recorder, the amount of time that you have, and all that. That was one of the questions that appeared.
The answer to that is not really.
Okay, cool.
It plays a role. For example, if I know that I have 25 minutes to go, to do a 25-minute talk piece, 25 minutes is not normally full enough for a serious talk piece. So I have to think in terms of something shorter, which would develop, but I'd only find my way to it. I once did a piece for radio. I was in a program where they put me on and they told me I had 27 minutes that I could talk. And I did the piece in such a way, I apparently have a very good inherent time sense. And I sculpted a piece as I was going along it that I knew would take about 26 or 27 minutes. I could tell it was going to go that way, not because I knew the numbers, but I knew it was shorter than the fullness, and yet it's actually the piece at the end of one of the books. It's a piece called "Who's Listening Out There," and I knew that, and I ended on the talk went exactly 26 minutes. So I must have an inherently odd sense of time in relation to the talks by the nature of the talk. I can choose a talk that will go shorter than one that will go longer. By my sense of the implications, I think I can draw out of it. Sometimes I'm wrong, so then I do another piece that uses the same material or some of the same material. Like 3 times I made good takes on Freud's introduction, on his interpretation of dreams. And I did 3 versions of it because I wasn't happy with the adequacy of any of them. Although each one had virtues the other one didn't have. So I was looking at 3 of a kind. I mean, it's a sort of funny situation. I don't know whether they're all worth publishing together or the sort of thing like that, or whether they're not worth publishing. I should do a 4th one that takes the most interesting things and develops them further. But sometimes you're left with that kind of odd. Because when you do what you can. And it's not like I have a half hour and I'm going to stop in exactly 30 minutes. It's like as I go along, I'm developing a piece that I know will run something like that.
And when you write them, I mean, when you transcribe them, so there's a bit of writing that goes in it, and some of the extreme cases could be the structuralist on one hand, and
endangered nouns.
And how about endangered nouns? Because there's no preface to it.
No, because it was part of a piece.
Ah, I see.
It was part of a piece called Remembering, or Forgetting. No, the piece was called Forgetting. Just like the manifesto, I never knew what time it was. The opening piece, which is the campy piece about the mattress, was the conclusion of the piece on postmodernism. I was supposed to be one of 2 featured speakers at the University of Louisville assemblage of scholars talking about postmodernism. And my arrival was slightly delayed because it was a snowstorm, and I was coming. I can't remember where I was. I think we were. I had to go through Atlanta because the snowstorm kept us out. And finally, I got back to Louisville from Atlanta. And the conference had already begun. The other keynote speaker was speaking. And I listened to him, and it was one of these conversations where you hear his vocabulary it didn't appear to be saying a great deal. It seemed to be indicating that Frantz Fanon made the mistake of dying, and therefore his work wasn't as relevant as Homi Bhabha, who happened to be alive, because they were both describing different phenomena. That is to say, and the speaker acted as if they were describing the same phenomena and different levels of virtue, because one described the contemporary situation of the emigre returns, the empire strikes back, as the nomadic situation. And Homi Bhabha is dealing with a situation that's not the same as Fanon. Fanon is dealing with a situation where some people trying desperately to assimilate have all these obstacles placed in their way to assimilation, and Frantz Fanon was like a revolutionary statement in its time, whereas the Homi Bhabha one is about a world being transformed by nomadism and going to the new globalism. But while that's the substance of the thing, nobody was paying attention to the substance of the thing. Everybody loved the kind of way in which he was talking, which seemed to invoke divine presences who would remain unnamed, but whose vocabularies were invoked, so that you would hear things like about the satrapies and hegemons, and what happened is you would see the audience, variously informed audiences, knowing that root structures as opposed to paranoia structures, as opposed to schizophrenic structures, that all these things were attached to the utterances of great figures who remained at the moment unnamed, by a Greek figure of speech called Paranomasia. And so everybody there thrilled to know, recognizing the sources of the vocabulary. It was like a magical vocabulary, which was the main interest in the whole talk. So I figured I got to do something different. I got to get away from this kind of lecture. I mean, I have nothing against Guattari and Deleuze, but although I disagree with them almost entirely, I still have nothing against intelligent disagreement. But I didn't like the particular style of the presentation at all, and I was beginning to freak out with it. So I decided I would tell the story of the mattress, and I began with a number of things, discuss the nature of what I regarded as the postmodern condition. And what I was really trying to deal with was, in a sense, that the postmodernism, it's not that certain works are postmodern, but there is what one calls a postmodern condition. And the postmodern condition is describable in a variety of ways, but one of the things that makes it so strange is that seemingly discrete historical phases overlap each other continuously, and that the past and the present are kind of constantly being redeployed in new ways. Like, for example, Nike produces its shoes. Nike, this international conglomerate, produces its shoes with slave labor done by hand in an old-fashioned manner and under tribal dominance. Whereas the company borrows its money from the International Monetary Fund if they need to, or they get kickbacks from the leaders of the countries in whose places they manufacture their crappy shoes. So that, in fact, you have the medieval high capitalist, the late capitalist bullshit overlapping each other and found simultaneously in the same place. And it struck me, this is what's startling about it. The ahistorical character, the things are no longer ever lost. They're retrieved and dumped into the situation like a kind of a vegetable soup. And you don't know what to expect of this situation. So it's very unpredictable. And one thing that is unpredictable about it is its relation to commodification. The rhetoric of commodity has always been very considerable, that people caution us about all the things that are available and the rather special way in which they're available and the surfeit of this. Actually, contemporary production produces objects that are always sufficiently unsatisfactory to produce complaints. Because essentially the situation has got nothing to do with what the consumer wants or needs. They literally try to engineer the consumer to want what they produce. So in effect, the desire for something, the desire for the perfect hunting knife, or the desire for a good guitar, or a car that is well made, is only going to be partially and superficially satisfiable unless you, like the guitar has a better chance because it's usually handmade. The car has a very poor chance because of the way the system is organized. And everything goes that way from things like houses that don't have walls of plaster, they have walls with bits of plaster between pieces of paper. You can put your finger through a wall in the contemporary building at this point. Do you really want that? I mean, do you want to save money by having a non-wall or an imaginary wall? It becomes like a hypothetical Japanese traditional house where you could put your finger through the wall, but everybody respects the wall because they have good manners. Well, that's what I call the virtual wall. You have virtual walls, you have doors that if you go through them too rapidly, God help you. And it seemed to me that the so-called great production societies do not produce satisfaction because what they produce is deliberately unsatisfactory material. So Ellie and I needed a mattress, and we wanted it to make sure it was a good mattress. And the uncertainty about the mattress, Ellie's skepticism. Ellie is a great skeptic about the quality of things. She can imagine toxins, which are very possible. She can imagine all sorts of things that would undermine the satisfaction of the things she's being forced to buy. And I think she's very wise in it, but you have to make a decision at some point. And I take kind of Cartesian radicalism. I figure let's go with it. But Ellie is always smarter than I am about this. And she says, well, what if it has this in it? What if it has that in it? She always drives waiters crazy in restaurants, particularly in countries where she doesn't speak the language, because she can't express exactly what troubles her about what she's being offered. And we had a meal the other day in a very pleasant restaurant where Ellie found the thing that she most preferred eating was the green beans. They did excellent haricot, but the rest of the meal had certain things insufficient in their character. And she was worried about whether this was this or this was good or not good. What kind of fish? Or she said they had a fish listed. And she said, what is that fish like? If someone asks you what is a red snapper like, how would you explain it? What is a red snapper like? It's not at all like a rabbit. It's not at all like a chicken. It's not like a shark, and she presents the waiter with incalculable problems, which I don't blame her for asking.
I asked him if it was like sea bass. So
yes,
I gave him.
I know, and he wasn't sure because he said he knew bass, but he didn't know the word sea bass, and he wasn't sure that sea bass was the right term. It's very difficult, and Ellie suffers from these hardships, and I took upon myself to tease her in the piece about to help define postmodernism as a state of uncertainty created by the culture, to force us to ask questions that we're not likely to get satisfying answers to.